The silence of space was broken only by the soft hum of machinery inside Frontier 9, a remote outpost stationed at the edge of known space. Lieutenant James Walker moved through the dimly lit corridor, making his usual rounds. 6 months into his 12-month assignment, the days had blended together in a monotonous routine. Another boring day in paradise, James muttered to himself as he checked the atmospheric readings on his tablet. The station's AI chimed in through his earpiece. "Lieutenant, I'm detecting an anomaly in Sector 4. Possible hull breach." James straightened immediately. "Show me," he commanded, and a holographic display appeared before him, highlighting a small section of the station's outer hull. "Scans indicate something impacted the station approximately 20 minutes ago," the AI continued. "The integrity field is holding, but there appears to be movement outside the hull." James frowned. "Movement? An asteroid wouldn't be moving after impact." "Correct. Readings suggest biological origin. This far from any habitable system, encountering life was rare." James grabbed his emergency kit and headed to the nearest airlock. "Prep my suit. I'm going to check it out." Once outside, tethered to the station, James navigated carefully across the hull's surface. What he saw made him freeze. Clinging to the station's exterior was a creature unlike any he had encountered in his years of service. It was roughly the size of a large dog, with a sleek body covered in dark scales that seemed to absorb the light around them. 6 limbs ended in sharp claws that had penetrated the station's outer layer. But what caught James's attention was the creature's eyes, glowing amber orbs that tracked his movement with unmistakable intelligence. "Station, are you seeing this?" James whispered into his comm. "Affirmative. Species unknown. Matching against database. Lieutenant, you need to return immediately." This matches descriptions of what local spacers call a shadow hunter, extremely dangerous predator. All encounters on record have ended in fatalities. James should have retreated. That would have been protocol. Instead, he moved closer, noticing how the creature's breathing seemed labored. One of its limbs was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark fluid, presumably blood, floated away in small globules. "It's hurt," James said. Lieutenant Walker returned to the station. "That's an order." Commander Bennett's voice cut through the comm. "That thing has taken down entire security teams. It's not worth the risk." The creature let out a sound, part hiss, part whine, and its claws loosened slightly from the hull. James realized it was going to drift away, injured and alone, in the vastness of space. In that moment, he made a decision that would change his life, and potentially the understanding of interspecies relations across the galaxy. "Sorry, Commander. Can't let it die out here." Before anyone could stop him, James extended his tether and captured the drifting creature in a containment net from his emergency kit. The shadow hunter thrashed weakly, then went still as if assessing this new development. Its eyes never left James. "I don't think you're as bad as they say," James said softly. "Let's get you inside." Back in the airlock, alarms blared as the station detected the unauthorized life form. "Override Safety Protocol Alpha 6, James commanded. "Medical emergency." "Lieutenant Walker," the AI warned, "bringing that creature aboard violates 17 separate regulations." "Note my objection in the log," James replied, already removing his helmet as the inner door opened. Commander Bennett and 2 security officers waited on the other side, weapons drawn. "Have you lost your mind, Walker?" Bennett demanded. The creature, now in the artificial gravity, huddled in the corner of the containment net, looking smaller and somehow more vulnerable. "Look at it, Commander," James said quietly. "It's intelligent, and it hasn't tried to attack me once." As if understanding the precariousness of its situation, the shadow hunter remained still, its amber eyes moving between the humans. "I'm calling it midnight," James added. "And I think it might just change everything we think we know about predatory species." An alarm suddenly cut through the tense standoff. The station's emergency lights began to pulse red. Incoming solar storm, the AI announced. All personnel must evacuate within 30 minutes. Bennett looked from the creature to James. Leave it. That's an order. But James knew, looking into those intelligent eyes, that he wouldn't abandon Midnight to die alone in an empty station. Some bonds, once formed, transcend all logic and regulation. The evacuation vessel hummed with activity as crew members rushed to secure equipment and prepare for departure. James moved quickly through the less-traveled maintenance corridors, the large storage container floating beside him on a gravity sled. "You doing okay in there?" he whispered, tapping lightly on the container side. A soft scratching sound came from within. Midnight's response. James had sedated the creature just enough to keep it calm during transport, using his limited knowledge of xenobiology to guess the proper dosage. The main hangar was chaos as James arrived. He guided his cargo toward the supply ship, trying to look casual despite his racing heart. "Walker, what's in the container?" called out Officer Reed, approaching with a scanner in hand. James positioned himself between Reed and the container. "Medical supplies from my station. Commander Bennett ordered me to bring them." Reed frowned. "I don't see that on the manifest." "Last-minute addition," James said, forcing a smile. "You know how the commander is about preparedness." Just then, the hangar speakers crackled. "Final boarding call. Solar flare approaching. All personnel must board immediately." Reed hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. Get it loaded." Once aboard, James found an isolated corner in the cargo hold and opened the container. Midnight lay curled inside, its dark scales rising and falling with each breath. The creature's injured limb looked worse in the ship's lighting. "I need to fix that," James murmured, reaching for his medical kit. As his hand approached, Midnight's eyes snapped open, alert despite the sedative. James froze, remembering the warnings. The creature could tear him apart in seconds. Instead, Midnight simply watched as James slowly retrieved a scanner and pain relief injector. "This will help," he explained, not knowing if the creature understood. "I'm not going to hurt you." To his surprise, Midnight extended the injured limb slightly, as if offering it for treatment. For the next hour, James worked carefully, setting the broken limb and applying a healing gel. Midnight remained still, occasionally making a soft clicking sound that James took as communication. "You're not what they say you are you?" James said softly. "The most dangerous predator in the galaxy wouldn't let me help like this." The ship's alarm suddenly blared, startling them both. "Unauthorized life form detected in Cargo Bay 7, announced the ship's eye. "Security team to Cargo Bay 7 immediately." James cursed under his breath. "They found us." He quickly closed the container, but it was too late. The cargo bay doors slid open as Captain Lars entered with 4 armed security officers. "Step away from the container, Lieutenant," Lars ordered. James stood his ground. "Captain, I can explain." "Explain harboring a Class X predator on an evacuation vessel. This should be interesting." Lars motioned to the security team. "Open it." The container lid lifted, revealing Midnight inside. The creature's scales seemed to absorb the light around it, creating an eerie shadow effect. The security team raised their weapons. "Don't shoot." James moved in front of the container. "It's injured and sedated. It's not a threat." "Every report we have says these creatures are killing machines," Lars replied. 3 colonies wiped out. A mining team found in pieces. It's too dangerous to keep alive. "Those reports might be wrong," James argued. "I've been treating it for hours. If it wanted to hurt me, it would have." Lars hesitated, then noticed the medical equipment beside the container. "You've been treating it." "Yes, and it's been cooperating." "This species might be misunderstood." Dr. Vega, the ship's science officer, pushed through the gathered crowd. "Let me scan it," she said, her curiosity clearly piqued. Captain Lars reluctantly agreed, and Dr. Vega approached with her scanner. Midnight remained still, watching the new human with those intelligent amber eyes. "These readings are remarkable," Dr. Vega said after a moment. "The neural activity suggests high intelligence, and these biological adaptations, I've never seen anything like them." "So it's not just a mindless killer?" James asked. "Far from it," Dr. Vega replied, excitement in her voice. "This creature could represent a scientific breakthrough. These adaptations could revolutionize our understanding of evolutionary biology." Captain Lars frowned. "It's still dangerous, but valuable," Dr. Vega countered. "I propose we establish a secure observation area. Study it under controlled conditions." Lars looked from the scientist to James, then to Midnight, who remained unnaturally still, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. "Fine," Lars finally said, "but you're responsible for it. Walker, one incident, and I'll jettison you both into space. Clear?" James nodded, relief washing over him. As the crowd dispersed, James knelt beside the container. Midnight's eyes met his, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. The first fragile thread of trust between human and the galaxy's most feared predator. 2 weeks had passed since Midnight came aboard. The creature's recovery surprised everyone, especially Dr. Vega, who documented its remarkable healing abilities. James spent every free moment in the observation room they had set up, slowly building trust with the Shadowhunter. Today, James entered with a protein pack, Midnight's favorite food so far. The creature uncurled from its resting position, scales shimmering with subtle iridescence under the lights. "Morning, Midnight," James said, placing the food on a tray. "Dr. Vega says you're almost completely healed." Midnight approached with a grace that belied its predatory nature. Over the past days, James had discovered the creature could move with absolute silence when it wanted to. Now it made small clicking sounds, a behavior James had come to recognize as friendly. "Lieutenant Walker to the bridge immediately," the ship's AI announced suddenly, breaking the peaceful moment. James frowned. "I'll be back soon," he told Midnight, who tilted its head as if understanding. On the bridge, tension filled the air. Captain Lars stood rigid, facing the main view screen where a massive vessel loomed, at least 5 times the size of their evacuation ship. Its hull was black with red markings that James recognized as the insignia of the Galactic Union's Special Operations Division. "They're hailing us again, Captain," the communications officer said. Lars nodded grimly. "Put them through." The screen flickered to show a stern-faced man with a scared left cheek and cold eyes. His uniform bore the rank of captain, but with additional insignia James didn't recognize. "This is Captain Reeve of the Dew Hunter's Mark. Prepare to be boarded. We have reason to believe you are harboring a Class X restricted organism." James's blood ran cold. How had they found out about Midnight? Lars stepped forward. "This is an evacuation vessel carrying civilians from Frontier 9. On what authority do you demand boarding?" "Galactic Union Executive Order 1138, Captain Reeve replied flatly. "The hunting and elimination of all Shadowhunter species. Our sensors detected the creature's unique biological signature. Stand down and prepare for boarding, or we will consider your vessel hostile." The screen went dark. "Can they do that?" James asked, stepping forward. Lars turned to him, face grim. "They already are. 2 shuttles launching from their ship. We can't outrun them." "Captain," Dr. Vega interjected, "the research we've gathered on this specimen is invaluable. This creature shows signs of intelligence far beyond what's been reported." "Tell that to Captain Reeve," Lars replied. "From the look of his ship, he's not here to study it." James felt panic rising. "We can't just hand Midnight over to be killed." "Midnight." Lars raised an eyebrow. "You named that thing." Before James could respond, the ship shuddered as the docking clamps engaged. The hunters had arrived. James rushed back toward the observation room, ignoring Lars' orders to stay on the bridge. He had to warn Midnight. But when he arrived, the room was empty. "Midnight," James called out, looking around frantically. The access panel to the ventilation system hung open. Somehow, Midnight had understood the danger and escaped. The door behind him slid open as 6 armed hunters entered, led by a woman with sharp eyes and a specialized tracking device. "Where is it?" she demanded. "I don't know," James answered truthfully. The woman held up her tracker, which beeped steadily. "It was here recently. You're the handler." James nodded, seeing no point in denying it. "Then you're coming with us," she said. "Captain Reeve wants to speak with you." Back on the bridge, Captain Reeve had boarded personally. His imposing figure seemed to fill the room as he paced slowly. "Lieutenant Walker," Reeve said as James was brought in, "I understand you've bonded with the Shadow Hunter." "It's not what people think," James replied. "It's intelligent, even gentle under the right circumstances." Reeve laughed, a harsh, cold sound. "Gentle? Do you know how many people these creatures have killed? They're the result of a biological weapons experiment gone wrong. They're not natural." "That can't be true," James argued. "Midnight has shown." "Midnight?" Reeve cut him off. "You named it like a pet. It's the last of its kind, Lieutenant. We've hunted them to near extinction for good reason." James felt his world tilt. "The last." "Almost," Reeve confirmed. "And once we find this one, the galaxy will be safer for it." A sudden alarm blared throughout the ship. "Security breach in Level 3, the AI announced. Unknown biological entity moving through maintenance tunnels." Reeve smiled coldly. "Found you." As the hunters rushed from the bridge, James made a split-second decision. He needed to find Midnight first. Breaking away from his guard, he ran for the emergency escape pods. If Midnight was as intelligent as he believed, that's where the creature would go. And if Reeve was telling the truth about Midnight being one of the last of its kind, James knew he couldn't let the hunters find it, even if it meant becoming a fugitive himself. The escape pod hurtled through space, its emergency thrusters firing erratically. Inside, James gripped the control panel, trying to stabilize their trajectory. Alarms blared as the pod's systems registered damage from their hasty departure. "That was too close," James muttered, glancing at Midnight. The creature clung to the wall opposite him. Its 6 limbs spread to maintain balance as the pod shuddered. Just as James had guessed, he'd found Midnight already inside the escape pod, as if the creature had known exactly where to go. "They'll follow us," James said, more to himself than to Midnight. "But we've got about an hour before they can track our signature through the radiation belt." Midnight's amber eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Then something extraordinary happened. The creature moved closer and placed one clawed limb against the viewport, gesturing toward a distant cluster of stars. "You want to go there?" James asked, surprised. Midnight made a series of clicking sounds, more complex than any James had heard before. Then the creature did something that left James speechless. It placed a limb against James's temple. A flood of images suddenly filled his mind. A lush jungle world, creatures moving through dense vegetation, feelings of safety and home. The vision was so vivid, so real, that James gasped and pulled back. "What was that?" he whispered, heart racing. "Did you just communicate with me?" Midnight tilted its head, then reached out again, more slowly this time. Hesitantly, James allowed the contact. More images came, but organized now like a story being told. Midnight species living peacefully on their world, apex predators, but ones that maintained balance in their ecosystem. Then came new creatures, aliens with weapons and ships, hunting Midnight's kind for sport, for trophies. The survivors changed, evolved rapidly over generations, becoming more dangerous, more lethal, adapting specifically to fight the hunters. Their reputation spread as they fought back against those who had nearly destroyed them. When the vision ended, James sat in stunned silence. "You can communicate through images," he said finally. "Empathic imagery. And no one ever knew because they were too busy trying to kill your kind." Midnight made a soft, affirming sound. "Those hunters, Captain Reeve. They've been eliminating your species because they think you're monsters, James continued, working through the implications. But they created those monsters by hunting you in the first place. The pod's navigation console beeped, indicating they were approaching a habitable system. James studied the scanner and recognized the jungle planet from Midnight's vision. "Is this your home?" he asked. Midnight made no sound, but James felt a wave of emotion that wasn't his own, a mixture of longing and warning. "Not exactly home, but somewhere safe," James guessed. Midnight blinked slowly in what James had come to recognize as agreement. The console suddenly flashed red as a new alert appeared. "They've found us already," James said, checking the readings. "Hunter's mark is on an intercept course." James plotted a new trajectory, taking them into the planet's atmosphere at a steeper angle than was safe. The pod groaned under the stress as flames licked at the viewport during their descent. "Hold on," James shouted as they broke through the clouded layer. The dense jungle canopy rushed up to meet them. The impact came violently, throwing James against the restraints. His head struck the console, and darkness flickered at the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Midnight moving toward him, those amber eyes filled with what appeared to be concern. When James awoke, sunlight filtered through the cracked viewport. The pod had come to rest in a clearing, its hull breached in several places. Pain throbbed in his ribs, and a cut on his forehead had left dry blood down the side of his face. "Midnight," he called, looking around the empty pod. A sound from outside caught his attention. Struggling to his feet, James made his way to the damaged hatch and pushed it open. What he saw took his breath away. The jungle stretched in all directions, vibrant with alien life. Strange birds with double wings soared overhead, and the vegetation pulsed with colors that shifted in the sunlight. "Midnight," he called again. A familiar clicking sound came from behind him. James turned to find Midnight emerging from the undergrowth, carrying something in its jaws, a plant with blue leaves. The creature approached and carefully placed the plant at James's feet, then looked up at him expectantly. "Is this for me?" James asked. Midnight tapped James's injured ribs gently with a claw, then nudged the plant forward again. "Medicine," James said, understanding dawning. "You're trying to help me." In that moment, looking into those intelligent eyes, James realized how wrong everyone had been. This wasn't just a predator with basic intelligence. Midnight was a sentient being with compassion, communication, and a history that deserved to be understood. And somewhere above them, Captain Reeve and his hunters were preparing to land. 3 days had passed since the crash. James sat beside a small fire, grinding the blue leaf plants Midnight had brought into a paste. His ribs still ached, but the alien medicine had reduced the swelling considerably. He applied the mixture to his injuries, wincing slightly at the sting. "This stuff works wonders," he said to Midnight, who watched from the edge of their makeshift camp. "Thank you." The shadow hunter made a soft clicking sound that James had come to recognize as acknowledgement. Over the past days, they had developed a routine. Each morning, Midnight would disappear into the jungle, returning hours later with food, strange fruits, and occasionally small prey animals. James would prepare what he could eat and leave the rest for Midnight. Today had been different. Midnight had indicated through gestures that James should follow. They had ventured deeper into the jungle than before, moving quietly through the dense undergrowth. "Where are we going?" James had asked, receiving only an insistent click in response. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where a stream cut through the jungle floor. Midnight crouched low, motioning for James to do the same. They waited in silence until a large creature approached the water, something like a cross between a deer and a lizard, with 6 legs and a scaled body. Midnight looked at James and made a series of deliberate movements, demonstrating a stalking technique. James understood. Midnight was teaching him to hunt. For the next hour, Midnight guided James through the approach, showing him how to place his feet, how to move with the rhythm of the jungle. When they finally made their move, James was surprised by his own newfound stealth. Together, they'd brought down the creature, Midnight disabling it while James delivered the killing blow with his utility knife. Now sitting by the fire and eating the most substantial meal he'd had since the crash, James felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. "We make a good team," he said. Midnight approached and sat beside him, closer than ever before, and placed a clawed limb gently against James's temple. The now familiar rush of images filled his mind, but this time they were different. James saw himself through Midnight's eyes, at first weak and strange, then curious and kind, and finally a respected hunting partner. He felt Midnight's initial confusion at being helped, followed by growing trust. When the connection broke, James was stunned by the depth of what had been shared. "You've been protecting me all along, haven't you?" he asked quietly. "Those predator calls we hear at night, you keep them away." Midnight blinked slowly, confirming his suspicion. Later that night, as James lay near the fire trying to sleep, a violent coughing fit overtook him. His chest burned, and his earlier sense of well-being evaporated as fever gripped him. Some jungle pathogen had found its way into his system, and without proper medical supplies, he was in serious trouble. By morning, James could barely stand. He shivered despite the tropical heat, his skin clammy and pale. "Not good," he mumbled as Midnight circled him anxiously. "Need medicine. Real medicine." Midnight seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The creature nudged the remaining blue leaves toward him, but James shook his head. "Won't be enough," he wheezed. "Need antibiotics from the pod." He tried to stand but collapsed. Through fever-blurred vision, he saw Midnight pace in apparent distress. Then, with a decisive click, the shadow hunter bounded into the jungle and disappeared. Hours passed. James drifted in and out of consciousness, his condition worsening. The sun had begun to set when he heard movement in the undergrowth. Expecting Midnight, he was shocked to see 3 more shadow hunters emerge into the clearing, led by his friend. The newcomers approached cautiously, their amber eyes studying him with intelligent curiosity. Midnight made a series of complex clicks and movements that clearly constituted language among their kind. One of the new arrivals, larger than Midnight with battle-scarred scales, stepped forward. It carried something in its mouth, a cluster of red berries that James didn't recognize. Midnight nudged the berries toward James, making urgent clicking sounds. With no other options, James took the berries and ate them. They were bitter, almost painfully so, but he managed to swallow them. Within an hour, his fever began to break. By sunrise, though still weak, he could sit up and take water. "You found others," James said to Midnight, as the shadow hunters watched from a respectful distance. "Your family." Midnight placed a limb against James's temple, sharing a single powerful image. James standing among shadow hunters, accepted, part of the group. The emotion that accompanied the image was clear. James was the first being in generations to show kindness to a shadow hunter, and that single act had changed everything. As James regained his strength throughout the day, he realized the profound truth before him. He hadn't just befriended a dangerous creature. He had found a connection that transcended species, built on mutual respect and care. The galaxy's most feared predator had become his most loyal ally. And somewhere above them, hunters still searched, unaware that their quarry was no longer alone. The sound of engines broke the jungle's morning peace. James, now fully recovered, stood at the edge of the clearing with Midnight and 3 other shadow hunters. They watched as a sleek black shuttle descended through the canopy, landing thrusters scorching the vegetation below. "They found us," James said quietly. Over the past week, he had come to know the small group of shadow hunters. Besides Midnight, there was Slate, the battle-scarred elder who had brought the healing berries, Echo, a younger female with unusual silver-flecked scales, and Dusk, a massive male who seemed perpetually on guard. Now they all stood alert, bodies tensed for action. "We need to hide," James urged, but Midnight stood firm, making a series of clicks that the others seemed to understand. The shuttle's hatch opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Captain Reeve emerged first, followed by 6 hunters in full combat gear. They carried weapons James recognized, pulse rifles designed specifically for big game hunting. "Stay behind me," James told the shadow hunters, stepping forward into the open. Reeve spotted him immediately. "Lieutenant Walker," he called, raising his weapon. "Step away from those creatures. Now." "I can't do that, Captain," James replied, keeping his voice steady despite his pounding heart. Reeve's hunters spread out in a semicircle, taking aim at the shadow hunters who remained partially concealed in the jungle's edge. "Those creatures are designated for elimination," Reeve said, his voice hard. "They're a plague that needs to be wiped out. Move aside, or we'll consider you a hostile." "You've got it all wrong," James insisted, taking another step forward. "These beings are intelligent. They have a language, a society. They're not mindless killers." Reeve laughed harshly. "Tell that to the colonies they've decimated. The mining crews found in pieces. Did you ever wonder why they attacked?" James challenged. "I've seen their memories. Your hunters started this, killing them for sport on their home planet generations ago. They evolved to fight back. Wouldn't you?" Midnight moved forward to stand beside James. The hunters immediately tensed, weapons tracking the shadow hunter's movement. "Don't shoot," James shouted, placing himself between Midnight and the hunters. "Just watch." With deliberate slowness, Midnight picked up a stick and began to trace patterns in the dirt. The hunters watched in disbelief as recognizable shapes emerged. Crude but unmistakable drawings of a ship, hunters with weapons, and shadow hunters. "It's drawing," one of the hunters whispered. "Impossible," Reeve muttered, but his weapon lowered slightly. James seized the moment. "They're one of the last colonies, Captain. They've been hiding here, trying to survive while you hunt them to extinction. They only attack when threatened." Reeve's expression hardened again. "Clever beasts can still be dangerous beasts, Lieutenant. Intelligence doesn't make them safe." "Then judge them by their actions," James countered. "Midnight saved my life, cared for me when I was injured. These beings have compassion." The standoff stretched into tense silence, broken suddenly by movement from the jungle. More shadow hunters emerged, 10, 20, then more, until nearly 50 surrounded the clearing. They made no aggressive moves, simply watching with those intelligent amber eyes. The hunters closed ranks, weapons raised. "There are more of them than we thought," a female hunter said, fear evident in her voice. Reeve assessed the situation with a tactician's eye. "We're outnumbered," he admitted. Midnight stepped forward again, making direct eye contact with Reeve. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, the shadow hunter deliberately laid down all its natural weapons. It retracted its claws, folded its defensive spines, and lowered itself to the ground in a clear gesture of peace. One by one, the other shadow hunters did the same. "They're standing down," James explained, "showing you they don't want to fight." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Reeve's face. He stared at the creatures, then at James. "The Galactic Union has declared them a threat," he said, but with less conviction. "The Union doesn't know what I know now," James replied. "These beings deserve protection, not extinction. They're the victims here, not the villains." Slate, the elder shadow hunter, approached slowly and placed something at Reeve's feet, a carved piece of wood. The hunter picked it up cautiously, turning it over in his hands. It was a perfect miniature replica of a Union shuttle, detailed down to the thrusters. "They've been watching us," Reeve realized, "studying us. Just as we study them," James said. "Captain, you have a choice now. Continue a needless war against a species fighting for survival, or be the one who helps correct a terrible mistake." Around them, The jungle had fallen silent, as if the entire ecosystem held its breath, waiting for Reeves' decision. The captain looked from the wooden carving to the gathered shadow hunters, then finally to Midnight, still in its peaceful pose. "Stand down," he ordered his team at last. "Lower your weapons." As the hunters reluctantly obeyed, Midnight rose and approached James, resting a clawed limb gently on his shoulder in a gesture that needed no translation. The confrontation had ended without bloodshed, the first peaceful meeting between hunters and hunted in generations. The Galactic Union Council chamber buzzed with tension. Hundreds of representatives from across known space filled the tiered seating, their voices a mixture of outrage, curiosity, and disbelief. At the center of it all stood James Walker, no longer in his lieutenant's uniform, but dressed in formal diplomatic attire. "Order," called the chief counselor, a tall woman with silver hair. "This emergency session will come to order." The room gradually quieted. James stood firm despite his nervousness. Beside him was Captain Reeve, now his unlikely ally. And behind them both waited Midnight and Slate in a special observation chamber. "Lieutenant Walker," the chief counselor began, "you stand before this council accused of interfering with a sanctioned extinction order, harboring dangerous predators, and violating at least 17 Union regulations. How do you plead?" "With respect, Counselor," James replied, his voice carrying through the chamber, "I plead for reason and understanding." A murmur rippled through the assembly. "For generations," James continued, "we've hunted shadow hunters based on fear and misunderstanding. I've lived among them. I've communicated with them. They are not the monsters we believe them to be. They've killed hundreds of our people," shouted a representative from the mining colonies. "After we nearly hunted them to extinction," James countered, "they evolved specifically to defend themselves against us. We created the very threat we fear." Captain Reeves stepped forward. "Counselors, I've spent 20 years hunting these creatures. I've seen firsthand the devastation they can cause. Yet what I witnessed on that jungle planet changed everything I thought I knew." The chamber fell silent as Reeve described the shadow hunters' display of intelligence, their art, and their deliberate choice to stand down when they could have easily overwhelmed his hunting party. "We have evidence," James added, activating a holographic display. The projection showed recordings from James's time with the shadow hunters. Midnight treating his wounds, the hunting lessons, the complex communication between the creatures. Most compelling was footage of Midnight drawing in the dirt, creating recognizable symbols. "This isn't just mimicry," James explained. "They have a language, a culture. They can communicate abstract concepts. And most importantly, they want peace." The chief counselor leaned forward. "If what you say is true, why have they never attempted communication before? Would you try to talk to someone who's been trying to kill you for generations?" James asked simply. A thoughtful silence fell over the chamber. "We request permission to bring 2 shadow hunters into this chamber," James said, "to demonstrate their intelligence directly." Gasps and protests erupted, but the chief counselor raised her hand. "Granted, but with full security protocols." Minutes later, Midnight and Slate entered, flanked by security officers. Many representatives recoiled, some even fled their seats. The shadow hunters remained calm, their amber eyes taking in the vast chamber with evident curiosity. "These 2 have agreed to demonstrate their problem-solving abilities," James explained. What followed astonished even James. Midnight and Slate approached a holographic puzzle set up in the center of the floor, a complex 3-dimensional maze designed to test advanced intelligence. Working together, communicating through their clicks and movements, they solved it in under 5 minutes. When they finished, Midnight approached the chief counselor directly. Guards tensed, but the shadow hunter simply extended a limb, offering connection. "It wishes to communicate," James explained, "through empathic imagery. With your permission, counselor." After a moment's hesitation, the chief counselor nodded. Midnight gently touched her temple. The woman's expression transformed, from fear to wonder to profound understanding. When the connection broke, tears glistened in her eyes. "I saw," she whispered, "their history, their suffering, their hope." She stood, addressing the chamber with new resolve. "What we have done is a travesty. These beings deserve protection, not extinction." The vote that followed was not unanimous, but the majority was clear. The Shadowhunters would be granted protected status. Their jungle planet would become a sanctuary, off-limits to hunters and developers. 1 month later, James stood at the entrance of the newly established Research and Cultural Exchange Center on the jungle planet. The simple buildings blended harmoniously with the environment, designed to minimize impact on the Shadowhunters' habitat. Midnight approached, now wearing a specialized communication device that translated its clicks and empathic projections into words. "The young ones come today," Midnight's translated voice announced. "They are eager to learn about humans." James smiled. "And our researchers are just as eager to learn about Shadowhunters." Together they watched as a group of human scientists welcomed young Shadowhunters into the center. Among them was Captain Reeve, now heading the protection force that kept poachers away from the sanctuary. "Did you ever imagine this?" James asked. Midnight's translator conveyed, "Not until you showed kindness when you could have shown fear." James gazed across the clearing where humans and Shadowhunters worked together, building something new and unexpected. The first integrated team was preparing for a joint mission, humans providing technology, while Shadowhunters contributed their natural skills and knowledge of unexplored regions. "They're calling us the Defenders now," James said, "not Shadowhunters anymore." "Names change when understanding grows," Midnight replied. As the sun set over the jungle, James reflected on how far they had come. One act of compassion toward an injured creature had changed the course of 2 species. The galaxy's most feared predator now worked alongside humans as partners, protectors, and friends. Sometimes, James thought, the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't tooth or claw or weapon. It's fear of what we don't understand. And sometimes, the bravest act isn't facing danger, but choosing to see beyond it.